Donut Dollies and the Vietnam War. Gaining their nickname from World War II in Korea, from February 1962 to March of 1973, Donut Dollies were deployed into Vietnam to provide support and a sympathetic ear for millions of U.S. servicemen who were hungry for news from back home, not to mention the chance to spend quality time with the girl next door. Selfless, brave, and resilient, armed only with their smile and bubbly personalities, the American Red Cross Donut Dollies traveled in pairs by helicopter, jeeps, and half-tracks, logging some 2 million miles into remote fire bases, where they brought much-needed warmth to soldiers counting down to the day when their year of service was finally over. During the height of the Vietnam War, over 600 young women responded to somewhat ambiguous Red Cross ads, seeking qualified young women willing to serve 1 year overseas. To be considered for the job, standards for acceptance were higher than those of the military, requiring a woman to be 21 years of age, college-educated, replete with letters of recommendation, and an outstanding personality for, according to Red Cross advertisements, a job that requires a capacity for hard work under less than ideal conditions. After only 2 weeks of training in Washington, D.C., the women shipped off for Vietnam in their signature pale blue outfits, manning recreation centers while visiting the wounded in evac hospitals throughout South Vietnam. Yet no one appreciated the presence of Donut Dollies more than troops stationed at remote fire bases in country, where they spent much-needed time with wholesome American women, talking about home or sports or music with fresh-faced beauties in ponytails, makeup, and a hint of perfume, helping many servicemen catch a moment's break from the harsh realities of war. Sometimes sleeping in bunkers under incoming mortar and sniper fire, Donut Dollies witnessed firsthand some of the worst tragedies of life in country, leaving many Vietnam veterans, even 5 decades after the war's unceremonious end, with fond memories and deep respect for the Donut Dollies that brought moments of sunlight to their darkest days as fighting men. George Wallace. Born in 1919 Clio, Alabama, George Corley Wallace earned his law degree from the University of Alabama, graduating in 1942 before his voluntary enlistment into the U.S. Army during World War II. Serving as Assistant State's Attorney in 1946, Wallace was elected to 2 terms in the state legislature before his election to the bench of the 3rd Judicial Circuit Court in 1953. Losing his first bid for the Alabama governorship in 1958 to a segregationist candidate endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, Wallace became known as a fighting judge due to his defiance of a federal civil rights investigation into Alabama's ongoing discrimination against African American voting rights. Wallace's growing reputation as a segregationist won him his first of 4 governorships in 1962, following up on his campaign promise in June of 1963 to stand in the schoolhouse door when federalized National Guardsmen forced Wallace to capitulate on his attempts to block black students from enrolling at the University of Alabama. His actions and hardline segregationist pronouncements made Wallace the national face of deeply entrenched racial segregationist sentiment held by many white Americans. And when he ran as a third-party candidate during the presidential election of 1968, he captured 13% of the vote, mainly from states in the Jim Crow's South. During his second term as governor, Wallace embarked on a second campaign for the Oval Office, until he was shot during an assassination attempt on May 15, 1972, an event which left him paralyzed below the waist for the remainder of his life. Serving 2 more terms as Alabama governor, by his final run for office in 1982, Wallace had renounced his segregationist ideology and sought reconciliation with civil rights leaders, receiving substantial support from black voters before retiring from politics in 1987 due to rapidly declining health. developing Parkinson's disease during his final years. Wallace died of septic shock on September 13, 1998, ending one of the last segregationist voices during the final years of the Jim Crow South. JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech. After the surrender of Germany, near the end of World War II, Berlin and the whole of Germany was divided between the Communist East and the Democratic West, causing Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to call West Berlin a bone in my throat, further vowing to eradicate this splinter from the heart of Europe. When Khrushchev later threatened to restrict Western access to West Berlin, in a televised address to the nation on July 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy pushed back at the Soviet leader's threat, announcing a major military buildup in Western-held Germany, further declaring that any attack on West Berlin would be viewed as an attack on the United States. As the Cold War reached its zenith years, less than 7 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and an equal number of months before JFK's tragic assassination, on June 26, 1963, after the young president viewed the Berlin Wall and the barrenness of East Berlin, he rejected a script written by his speechwriters, penning his own words for an address before an enthusiastic crowd of West Berliners, a speech that would galvanize his presidency, at the same time highlighting his staunch defense of democracy and self-determination.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. For it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy. With election season fast approaching, on November 22, 1963, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy joined her husband on a 10-mile motorcade through Dallas, Texas, in a convertible Lincoln Continental limousine, waving to an enthusiastic crowd that lined the parade route. Along for the ride sat Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie, when at 12:30 in the afternoon, as their limo passed the Texas School Book Depository building, 3 shots rang out from a 6th-floor window, ending the life of the 35th President of the United States and seriously wounding Governor Connally.
From Dallas, Texas, the apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded.
A flash from Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds. This is the latest information we have from Dallas. I will repeat with the greatest regret, 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he has died of bullet wounds.
John F. Kennedy died at approximately 1 o'clock Central Standard Time today here in Dallas.
For those Americans alive at the time, the tragic murder of the commander-in-chief gutted a nation to its core. Passing away at Parkland Hospital at the still young age of 46, at 2:39 that same afternoon, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took the presidential oath aboard Air Force One as it sat on the runway at Dallas Love Field, in front of 30 eyewitnesses, including Jackie Kennedy, who still wore clothes stained with her dead husband's blood. 7 minutes later, Air Force One departed Dallas for its return flight to Washington, carrying with it the slain president's body. Less than an hour after JFK's murder, 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald took the life of Dallas police officer J.D. Tibbet, who had stopped Oswald near the suspect's Dallas rooming house. 2 days later, while Oswald was being moved from Dallas police headquarters to a more secure location, the suspected assassin was himself slain by strip club owner Jack Ruby, which in turn laid the groundwork for years of speculation and conspiracy theories regarding who ordered the president's assassination. On November 25, 1963, a nation came together to mourn the loss of a dynamic American icon, as Kennedy's horse-drawn caisson traveled from the U.S. Capitol to a requiem mass at St. Matthew's Cathedral, before leaders from 92 countries followed his caisson to Arlington National Cemetery, where he was buried with full military honors on a slope below Arlington House. At the request of his widow, Jacqueline lit an eternal flame, which still burns to this day in honor of the fallen president, making the assassination of John F. Kennedy a prescient foreshadowing of a nation's violent years to come. Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. During his residency at the Perry Lane Artist Colony near the campus of Stanford University, Ken Kesey earned a graduate fellowship in creative writing after graduating from the University of Oregon. After participating in government-sponsored studies on the effects of hallucinogenic drugs such as mescaline and LSD, he wrote the wildly successful novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. During his literary rise, Kesey assembled an entourage of first-generation acid heads known as the Merry Pranksters, who modified an old 1939 International Harvester school bus into a traveling road show known as Further, or in popular culture, the Magic Bus. When the publication of his second novel, Sometimes a Great Notion, required his presence in New York, Kesey and his Merry Pranksters took to the road in Further for an LSD-soaked road trip to the East Coast as they attempted to create art out of everyday life. The entire journey was filmed for a planned movie that never came together, while at the wheel of Further was hammer-tossing Neil Cassidy, who was author Jack Kerouac's inspiration for his road-hungry character Dean Moriarty in his Beat Generation novel On the Road. Speakers on the inside of the bus piped in road sounds from outside the bus, while speakers on top of the bus blared the sounds of the pranksters from inside the bus, creating a mayhem of competing sounds for the tripping occupants within. The pranksters were given prankster names, which foretold the pranking madness of what it meant to be on the bus. There was Doris DeLay, on account of her uncanny likeness to film star Doris Day. There was Generally Famished, on account of her constant hunger during the now legendary acid-fueled bus trip. There was Hassler, on account of the fact that he hassled with all things electronic and audio during the acid test that would follow the bus trip. Others included Black Maria, Cool Breeze, Hermit, Zonker, Gretchen Fetchen the Slime Queen, Stark Naked the Beauty Witch, Something's Missing, Cadaverous Cowboy, Pitcher, No Turn Unstoned, Mary Microgram, Barely Visible, the Minister of Information, and of course the Chief, Ken Kesey himself, at the helm of his merry band of truth seekers, as they attempted to unvalve their minds through acid. Once the pranksters had done their New York thing, they headed upstate for a visit with Timothy Leary, who was the undisputed acid guru of the eastern seaboard. While Leary contended that a controlled set and setting were vital for a safe acid trip, Kesey and the pranksters believed in multimedia madness for their now legendary acid tests held in and around the San Francisco Bay Area, which included immense light shows that beamed old movies in psychedelic spirals, lava blobs, and black light shooting stars everywhere throughout their chosen festival site. Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead became the pranksters' house band, creating the sort of mellow, spongy music that acid heads found irresistible. The high water mark for the pranksters began to unravel in late 1966, after the federal government outlawed the use or possession of LSD. Even before the law was passed, Kesey was arrested on a largely trumped-up possession of marijuana charge at his La Honda home. Following a second marijuana arrest 2 days later, a two-strike crime at the time that came with a mandatory prison sentence. In response, Kesey faked his own suicide by having friends leave his truck on a cliffside near Eureka, along with an elaborate suicide note written by the pranksters. Kesey fled to Mexico in the back of a friend's car, only to return to the States 8 months later, where he was promptly apprehended by police. After serving 5 months in the San Mateo County Jail, upon his release, he moved back to his family farm in Pleasant Hill, Oregon, where he maintained a secluded, family-oriented lifestyle for the rest of his life. Perhaps still a prankster at heart, but a prankster no more. The Crescent City Tsunami of 1964. On Good Friday, 1964, at exactly 5:36 p.m., the largest earthquake ever recorded in North America, a whopping 9.2 magnitude on the Richter scale, decimated Anchorage, Alaska, collapsing buildings while taking 131 innocent lives. Lasting 4 minutes and 38 seconds, the megathrust earthquake unleashed a series of 5 tsunami waves, each one more powerful than the last, reaching open ocean wave heights of 150 feet before slamming into the coastlines of Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, and the United States. Hardest hit was the small logging and fishing community of Crescent City, California, just south of the Oregon border, when in the late night hours of March 27th, 4 to 5 tsunami waves swept through 60 blocks of the town of some 3,000 residents, completely destroying 29 blocks in the harbor area, while taking the lives of 12 people and injuring 24 others. In an area prone to tsunamis as far back as the 1700s, after the first wave swept through town, father and son tavern owners Gary and Bill Clausen returned to the Long Branch with Gary's wife, Bill's fiancée, and 2 employees, mopping up the floor before celebrating Bill's birthday with one last drink of the night. Their decision would prove fatal when the second wave ripped the Long Branch off its foundation. Escaping to their now floating roof, they boarded a runaway boat in hopes of reaching safety. Instead, the boat capsized in raging waters, taking the lives of everyone but 27-year-old Bill Clausen. When the fourth wave came ashore under the light of a full moon, Battery Point lighthouse keepers Peggy Coons and her husband Roxy watched in horror as the ocean receded more than 3/4 of a mile offshore, exposing a labyrinth of once underwater caves, canyons, and basins, taking with it the Citizen's dock and a large lumber barge, before a frightening wall of water passed their lighthouse fortification and swept into town. Peggy recalls that as the water flushed back out to sea, cars and buildings were now moving seaward again. Beds, furniture, televisions, mattresses, and other objects were moving by so fast that we could barely tell what they were, making the Crescent City tsunami of 1964 one of the most devastating events in California's long history of natural catastrophes. Lyndon B. Johnson. Born in 1908 Central, Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson graduated from Southwest State Teachers College while paying for his education by teaching disadvantaged Mexican-American students in South Texas, providing young Johnson with a first-hand taste of poverty and discrimination that would later bear fruit for a nation's disadvantaged poor. Moving to Washington, D.C. as a congressional secretary for Texas Representative Richard Kleberg, Johnson met and married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor, who would later become a critical part of Johnson's political success. His political career took off in earnest in 1937, when he was elected to the House of Representatives as a Democrat, becoming the first member of Congress to volunteer into the military when the United States entered World War II in 1941, serving as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy until all members of Congress were recalled to Washington in the summer of 1942. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948 by a narrow margin of just 87 votes, Johnson became a driving force in Congress with his knack for pushing through key pieces of legislation, serving first as the minority leader of the Senate, followed by Senate Majority Leader when Democrats took control of Congress in 1955. Despite bad blood between Johnson and the Kennedys, in 1960, John F. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his running mate for his successful bid for the White House, only to be sworn in as president following JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963, an event which gutted a nation to its core. Johnson quickly declared a war on poverty in America, pushing Congress to pass legislation addressing illiteracy, unemployment, and racial discrimination. Winning a second term by more than 15 million votes over Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, Johnson launched his Great Society campaign, which created Medicare and Medicaid and federal health insurance for the elderly and the poor, at the same time combating ongoing Jim Crow racial prejudice by signing the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A firm believer in the now discredited domino theory regarding the spread of communism, Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War made him widely unpopular with the American voting public, leading to his decision not to run for re-election in the presidential season of 1968. He retired to his ranch in Texas to write his memoir and to establish his presidential library, passing away from a heart attack on January 22, 1973, making the life and politics of Lyndon B. Johnson a mixed bag of social advances on the home front amidst a deepening war in Southeast Asia. The Great Society of Lyndon B. Johnson. To look back before the legislative reforms of LBJ's Great Society movement of the 1960s, American life before his directives was a very different place. He saw racial discrimination and poverty as moral issues, not just political talking points, to be debated but not acted upon.
For in your time we have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. The great society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
The Great Society was a cluster of progressive programs undertaken by the President and Congress, which generated great hope among the downtrodden and the disillusioned. It was quixotic and Arthurian, this idea of might for right, inspiring programs for social justice that still resonate to this day. The war on poverty was part of an idea that you had not a hand out, but a hand up. In the 1960s, it was hardscrabble for a lot of Americans, and what the war on poverty meant for these people was jobs, bringing the less affluent into the mainstream of society. When Lyndon Johnson became president, the poverty rate teetered at a staggering 22%, compared to 9.2% today. By the time he left office 5 years later, the poverty rate was less than 13%, which constituted the greatest one-time reduction in the history of the United States. Johnson and civil rights groups managed to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which comprised the first major civil rights legislation since 1875. The act said that public accommodations have to be available to everyone without discrimination on the basis of race. And with one fell swoop, Johnson's Great Society movement wiped out all the whites-only signs in the segregated South. Perhaps the greatest benefit of Johnson's Great Society was Medicare, for before its time, people who reached the age of 65 had no guaranteed health insurance, while today, after LBJ and Congress passed the Medicare Act, in 2021, some 63 million senior Americans are enrolled in Medicare. While most presidents are happy to have one or two pieces of significant legislation attached to their legacy, Johnson pushed through an uncanny amount of impactful laws, which altered the face and very fabric of the nation up to this day.
I believe, at least it will be said, that we tried.
The Vietnam War protest movement. The anti-Vietnam War movement began in earnest in 1960, when 1,100 Quakers surrounded the Pentagon for 2 days of silent protest against the war, followed by anti-war protests in England and Australia in 1963. The largest of the war occurred on April 17, 1965, when 15,000 to 25,000 protesters marched on Washington, D.C., while on May 17, 1968, 9 Catholic priests, now known as the Catonsville Nine, broke into a local draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland, stealing 378 draft notices for young men in the 1A category who were most likely up next to get drafted into the war, burning them in a soup of homemade napalm, at the same time propelling their civil disobedience to viewers around the world. Despite the overwhelming violence and distractions of the late 1960s, major protests around the world continued to accelerate with each passing year of an unjust war. 24 in 1968, 16 in 1969, 20 in 1970, and a combined 21 in 1971 and 72. During the peak years of the Vietnam War, Americans witnessed protesting throngs of largely hippie-esque looking young Americans, leading the media and federal officials to attach the anti-war movement with the counterculture hippie movement, doing much to silence conservative voices that might otherwise have supported the moral bent of the movement. On April 30th, 1970, after President Richard Nixon announced the war's expansion into Cambodia, on May the 1st, students at 900 U.S. high school and university campuses began an anti-war protest strike, which escalated rapidly after the May 4th Kent State massacre, when 29 National Guardsmen opened fire on peaceful anti-war protesters at Kent State University, killing Allison Krauss, Sandy Schuer, Jeffrey Miller, and William Knox Schroeder. Two of the victims, Schuer and Schroeder, had been walking to class when they were struck by stray bullets, making the Vietnam War protest movement a time of deep division in America and the free world at large. The Immigration Act of 1965. In a nation populated mainly by periodic waves of foreign immigration, since its early inception, generations of American legislators have challenged and oftentimes limited certain ethnic populations seeking entry into the United States, including the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Other limiting bills included the Immigration Act of 1917, which established literacy requirements for immigrants arriving from Asia, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which banned Asian immigration entirely, while setting quotas on the number of immigrants allowed in from Eastern and Southern European nations. The later spawned by a xenophobic and quite racist belief that immigrants from these regions were simply too foreign for America. That all ended during the 1960s, when the 89th U.S. Congress passed the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, so named for the legislators who helped move the bill through both houses of Congress. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on December 1, 1965, the bill overturned the system of quotas set forth in the Immigration Act of 1924, which in turn opened up a new stream of inbound migration, primarily from Asia and Latin America, effectively altering the character and melting pot complexion of American immigration history.
Repeat after me. I hereby declare on oath that I renounce all allegiance and fidelity.
Combined with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act created a triumvirate of legislation spawned by the Civil Rights Movement, establishing a conscious attempt by American politicians to remove racial and national criteria from all aspects of American law. According to the Pew Research Center, in 1960, 84% of U.S. immigrants were born in Canada or Europe, while 9.5% came from Latin America and 3.8% from Asia. In 2017, by contrast, 13.2% came from Canada or Europe, 50.4% from Latin America, and 27.4% from Asia, making the Immigration Act of 1965 an equalization milestone for immigrants in search of a better life. The Summer of Love. Egged on by the Beat Generation poets and novelists of the 1950s, a group that flourished in the North Beach community of San Francisco, the Summer of Love hippie movement sprang to life after the Human Be-In held in Golden Gate Park on January 14, 1967, when acid guru Timothy Leary coined the phrase, "turn on, tune in, and drop out." By the summer of 1967, more than 100,000 like-minded flower children migrated from around the country to the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco, vibing on hippie music, psychedelic drugs, anti-war sentiment, and an overwhelming spirit of free love. After Les Paul invented the electric guitar, the baby boom generation of the 1960s gravitated toward amplified rock and roll music, which was in direct conflict to the gentle swing-era dance tunes of their parents' generation. Flower children embraced a heavy mistrust of the government and the capitalistic ways of their parents, forming non-consumerist communal groups like the Diggers, who established a free store and a free medical clinic, while psychedelic drug groups like novelist Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters through acid tests intended to unvalve the minds of the once staid, largely suburban, middle-class youth. In the spring of 1967, the Council for the Summer of Love was created by the communal groups The Family Dog, the Diggers, the Straight Theater, and the hippie newspaper The San Francisco Oracle, who sought to alleviate some of the problems anticipated from the influx of hippies expected to descend on Haight-Ashbury as the summer bore down. The council lent support to the Diggers Free Clinic before organizing housing, food, sanitation, and links to local churches and social groups. When spring break came around, thousands of high school and college students descended on the Haight, causing alarm among San Francisco authorities. But once school ended for the summer, the onslaught pressed into high gear. Radical journalist Hunter S. Thompson called the Haight-Ashbury in an article in the New York Times Magazine, which further inspired more hippies to migrate west to San Francisco. Music festivals further ignited the Summer of Love, including the Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Music Festival, as well as the Monterey Pop Festival, which drew hippies to the electrified sounds of The Who, The Grateful Dead, The Animals, Jefferson Airplane, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin. After the mass departure of hippies at the end of the summer, a mock Summer of Love funeral was held by organizer Mary Casper, who issued a call to arms for all departed hippies, encouraging them to bring the revolution to wherever they called home. As Grateful Dead guitarist Bob Weir commented, Haight-Ashbury was a ghetto of bohemians who wanted to do anything, and we did, but I don't think it has happened again since. Yes, there was LSD, but Haight-Ashbury was not about drugs. It was about exploration, finding new ways of expression, and being aware of one's existence. Robert F. Kennedy. Born in 1925 Brookline, Massachusetts, the seventh of 9 children born to Joseph and Rose Kennedy. After serving in the U.S. Navy during World War II, Robert Kennedy graduated from both Harvard University and the University of Virginia School of Law before joining the U.S. Department of Justice as a working attorney. After managing his brother John's successful 1952 campaign for the U.S. Senate, Robert worked under anti-communist crusader Senator Joseph McCarthy, gaining national attention while investigating corruption in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters led by Jimmy Hoffa. After JFK won the office of president in 1960, Robert was named the 64th Attorney General to the United States, where he continued his fight against corruption in labor unions, organized crime, and civil rights for African Americans, where in 1962 he sent thousands of federal troops to Oxford, Mississippi, to enforce a U.S. Supreme Court mandate allowing African Americans to attend the University of Mississippi. Working closely with JFK and later President Lyndon Johnson, Robert helped pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed racial discrimination in employment, public facilities, and voting. And prior to JFK's tragic 1963 assassination in Dallas, Robert became JFK's closest political advisor during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, before winning election to the U.S. Senate in 1965. As a senator from the state of New York, Robert continued his push for African American civil rights and other social issues, including an end to the Vietnam War. Urged by his supporters to run for president, on March 16, 1968, Robert announced his bid for the White House, declaring, "I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies." On June the 5th of that same year, after winning the California Democratic primary, Robert Kennedy was assassinated at 42 years of age, shot in a Los Angeles hotel by a Palestinian extremist. following Robert's star-studded funeral service at Manhattan's St. Patrick's Cathedral. 700 mourners boarded a 21-car train bound for Arlington Cemetery near Washington, D.C., sparking an emotional and nationally cathartic 8-hour train ride, which inspired one of the most unique cross-pollinations of grief for those on the train and average Americans who line the tracks in tribute to yet another fallen icon, making the life of Robert F. Kennedy one of public service and sacrifice to an American nation. RFK's funeral train.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
From him. Incidentally, Seaman Smith, his brother-in-law, and one of the key men in his campaign was also shot in the head.
Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968.
Perhaps no other political figure in the turmoil of the 1960s possessed the knack to bring poor whites and blacks to the same table as peace-loving brothers. 5 years after his older brother, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated, 42-year-old Robert Kennedy was slain by a Palestinian extremist in a Los Angeles ballroom after winning a crucial California presidential primary. Following Robert's star-studded funeral service at Manhattan's St. Patrick's Cathedral, 700 mourners boarded a 21-car train bound for Arlington National Cemetery near Washington, D.C., sparking an emotional and nationally cathartic 8-hour train ride, which inspired one of the most unique cross-pollinations of grief for those on the train and average Americans who line the tracks in tribute to yet another fallen American icon. During the 225-mile train ride, Robert's casket sat in a glass-lined observation car at the back of the train, replete with a military honor guard that drew tears from those on and off the train. Emerging from a tunnel under the Hudson River, passengers aboard the train glimpsed enormous crowds lining the tracks, including a small harbor boat named the John F. Kennedy, her crew standing at attention. Tragedy struck when 2 people were killed by the train after crowds spilled out onto the tracks, prompting railway officials to cancel all northbound trains before sending a pilot train in front of the funeral train, slowly urging mourners from the tracks. Through small towns and large cities alike, trackside mourners displayed their raw grief in a variety of ways. In New Brunswick, a lone bugler played taps. Approaching Philadelphia, a junior high band played America the Beautiful. At Philadelphia's 30th Street station, onlookers linked arms and sang Glory, Glory, Hallelujah and the Battle Hymn of the Republic, one of RFK's favorite songs. As the train moved on across a hot summer landscape, working people, businessmen, housewives, and Boy Scouts lined the tracks in tribute to a fallen hero, some saluting or with their hand over their heart, while others bore signs like Bless RFK and the most common one, Bye Bobby. Tens of thousands of poor blacks already bereft from the loss of Martin Luther King Jr. just 2 months prior, journalist Jack Newfield wrote, stood weeping and waving goodbye on one side of the railroad tracks, alongside tens of thousands of poor whites on the other side of the train, waving American flags, standing at attention, hands over their hearts, tears running down their faces, making Robert Kennedy's final train ride a moment of collective grief during one of the most turbulent decades in American history. The Woodstock Music and Arts Festival. While the Diggers' mock funeral marked the symbolic end of the Summer of Love, in a larger sense, The Woodstock Music and Arts Festival in the summer of 1969 ushered out the peace and love hippie movement of the 1960s.
The Woodstock Music and Art Fair, the 3-day Aquarian Exposition at White Lake and Bethel, New York, will give you uncomplicated, unhurried, calm days of peace and music. Friday, August 15th, you'll hear stars such as Joan Baez, Arlo Guthrie, Tim Hardin, Richie Havens, Ravi Shankar, and many others. Saturday, August 16th, Canned Heat, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Grateful Dead, Janis Joplin, Jefferson Airplane, and The Who. Sunday, August 17th, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Santana, Jimi Hendrix, Johnny Winter, and that's not all.
Staged on Max Yasker's dairy farm in Bethel, New York, some 40 miles southwest of the small village of Woodstock, the 3-day event kicked off on August 15th, 1969, headlining 32 major acts to an overcapacity crowd of counterculture attendees.
This is the largest group of people ever assembled in one place. The important thing that you've proven to the world is that 500,000 kids, and I call you kids because I have children older than you are, 500,000 young people can get together and have 3 days of fun and music, and have nothing but fun and music, and I God bless you for it.
Financed by New York City entrepreneurs Joel Rosenman and John Roberts, Woodstock was promoted by Michael Lane and Artie Cornfield, who co-organized the heavily attended Miami Pop Festival the previous year. In April of 1969, Creedence Clearwater Revival became the first major act to sign a contract for the event, agreeing to play for $10,000 or roughly $70,000 in today's currency. While Woodstock was first conceived as a profit-making venture, it soon became a free concert when circumstances prevented organizers from installing fences or ticket booths before opening day. The influx of concertgoers quickly overwhelmed the small town of Bethel, while creating a massive traffic jam that shut down the New York State Thruway.
Can you dig that? New York State Thruway is closed, man.
Originally planned for 50,000 people, Woodstock saw 450 to 500,000 attendees crowd onto Yasker's farm, forcing many to struggle against bad weather, food shortages, and poor sanitation. Despite these critical setbacks, the festival was remarkably peaceful, recording 2 fatalities, neither to violence, and 2 births. By the time Jimi Hendrix took to the stage as the final act at Woodstock, the crowds had thinned considerably to an estimated 200,000 people, making Woodstock one of the most quintessential moments in rock and roll history. A bad day for rock and roll at the Altamont Music Festival. After the 3-day music festival at Woodstock, Rolling Stones lead singer Mick Jagger began obsessing about a similar music event in San Francisco, including a film documentary of the event soon nicknamed Woodstock West.
We are doing a free concert in San Francisco on December 6th.
Knowing the city lacked the infrastructure for such a mass invasion of stoned-out concert-goers, San Francisco officials quickly shut down the notion, forcing the Stones to sign a financially bad deal to host the event at Sears Point Raceway in Sonoma. Pulling out of the deal just 2 days before the previously announced event, roadies moved the stage and sound system 80 miles southeast to Altamont Speedway near Livermore, California. Due to Jagger's long-standing dislike of police, at the behest of the Grateful Dead, the Stones hired the Hells Angels motorcycle gang for concert ground security, paying them $500 in beer to cover the event. When the concert kicked off on December 6, 1969, to an overcapacity crowd of more than 300,000 people, the Angels turned violent almost the moment they arrived, beating back concertgoers with sawed-off pool cues, metal pipes, and motorcycle chains. To make matters worse, a batch of bad acid had circulated widely throughout the concert grounds, increasing conflicts between stoners and the openly violent Hells Angels. The concert included sets by Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the Grateful Dead and the Rolling Stones. Although the Dead backed out after the Angels' unmitigated violence became amplified under the worsening effects of alcohol and drugs. Even the lead singer of Jefferson Airplane, Marty Balin, was knocked unconscious when he tried to stop fights from breaking out between the Angels and concertgoers pressing in on the stage.
Hey man, I'd like to mention that the Hells Angels just smashed Marty Balin in the face and knocked him out for a bit. I'd like to thank you for that.
Having already been involved in a fight with the Angels, when the Stones took the stage after dark, teenager Meredith Hunter tried to scale a speaker cabinet for a better view of the band's rendition of Under My Thumb. When he was quickly knocked off the cabinet by Hell's Angels, Hunter drew a gun and threatened his aggressors, prompting Angel Alan Passero to draw a knife and stab the teen no less than 4 times. Hunter died at the scene, and while Passero was put on trial for first-degree murder, after footage surfaced of Hunter drawing his gun, Passero was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. America in the 1970s. Summing up the 1970s, novelist Tom Wolfe coined the term Me Decade in his essay, The Me Decade and the Third Great Awakening, published by New York Magazine in August of 1976. The term described a general new attitude of Americans towards atomized individualism, while turning away from the communal brotherhood of the 1960s. Many Americans, particularly working-class and middle-class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the race riots, the anti-war protests, the hippie counterculture movement, by embracing a new kind of conservative populism. Fed up with what they saw as soft underbelly hippies and whiny anti-everything protesters, they had also grown weary of a federal government that appeared to coddle the poor at taxpayers' expense, forming a political movement that became known as the silent majority. In some ways, though, 1960s liberalism continued to flourish in a growing crusade to shut down environmental abuse after the Love Canal toxic waste spill and the near meltdown at 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. During the 1970s, many groups of Americans continued to fight for expanded social and political rights, including the 1972 ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Affirmative action versus reverse discrimination became a forefront issue in America's ongoing fight for racial equality, until a 1978 Supreme Court ruling limited the use of numerical quotas, but recognized that race could be used as one of the factors in admission policies for colleges and universities. The OPEC-inspired oil crisis of 1973 saw long lines at gas stations due to fuel shortages and gas rationing programs, while Nixon would resign from office to avoid impeachment due to the Watergate scandal.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore.
War ended in Southeast Asia with the fall of Saigon, while back on the home front, the fad-happy decade saw the birth of 8-track tapes and disco sensations such as ABBA, Olivia Newton-John, Donna Summer, and the Bee Gees. On the rock front, bands like the Rolling Stones, Van Halen, Pink Floyd, and Queen dominated the airwaves, while soft rock solo artists like Jackson Browne and Billy Joel packed stadiums wherever they performed. The Great Postal Strike of 1970. By the end of the 1960s, pay raises for postal workers were virtually non-existent, rising by a scant $2,260 after 21 years of employment, despite the physical demands of the job, which led to turnover rates of 23% every 5 years. Tensions reached a boiling point, however, after Congress proposed a 41% pay raise in congressional salaries, while their proposed increase for postal worker pay clocked in at a dismal 5.4%. In response, letter carriers in New York called for a strike on March 17, 1970, and when union bosses from the National Association of Letter Carriers refused to strike on grounds that it was illegal for federal workers to do so, a group of New York pro-strike postal workers, led by Vincent Sombrado, defied union management and walked off their jobs the following morning.
Since Wednesday, when 6,500 New York City letter carriers refused to shoulder their mail pouches, the strike has spread from coast to coast. Now it directly affects 14 states and has involved about 200,000 postal workers.
You can't live in New York City on what they're giving us.
I've been told I'm eligible for welfare, but I don't want to take welfare.
As letter carriers took to picket lines in Manhattan, some 150,000 to 200,000 postal workers in 30 other cities followed suit, making the event the largest walkout of federal employees in U.S. history. At the same time, freezing delivery of some 270 million pieces of mail a day. In an age before the internet and email, documents critical to government, finance, and other industries were sidelined in postal warehouses, at the same time bringing financial hardships to poor people waiting on welfare checks, while young men fearful of being drafted into the Vietnam War were left to worry if they were about to be called up for active duty or exempted from the war. In response to the mounting logjam, President Richard M. Nixon declared a federal emergency, calling in the National Guard to deliver the mail in an effort to keep the American economy on track.
What exactly are you doing?
I don't really know. Do you think you're doing it as fast as a postal worker? No, I don't.
And after 8 days of sorting and delivering mail by inexperienced reservists, the Wildcat strikers went back to work on Nixon's promise of a retroactive pay hike of 6%, followed by an additional 8% after Nixon signed the Postal Reorganization Act on August 12th of that same year, making the Great Postal Strike of 1970 a time of letterless stagnation for Americans everywhere. Three Mile Island. On March 16, 1979, just 12 days before disaster struck at 3 Mile Island, the blockbuster movie China Syndrome hit American theaters, casting a terrifying glow on the nuclear power industry, which had grown exponentially since the 1973 oil embargo forced a nation to embrace alternative energy sources. Built atop an island on the Susquehanna River, some 10 miles from Pennsylvania's state capital at Harrisburg, at 4 a.m. on March 28th, a pressure valve in the Unit 2 reactor at 3 Mile Island jammed in the open position, spilling radioactive cooling water into adjoining buildings. Emergency cooling pumps immediately kicked into action. However, trained employees of the Metropolitan Edison Company misread the situation, shutting off the emergency coolant system, which in turn heated the uranium core to over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, just 1,000 degrees short of a full reactor meltdown. News of the impending disaster went public by 8 a.m., despite MedEd's PR campaign of obfuscation, which combined with a media feeding frenzy that sent local residents into a state of mass panic and hysteria. 12 hours later, MedEd nuclear engineers came to grips with their mistake, restarting the cooling pumps, which dropped core temperatures with less than an hour to spare before a complete meltdown became a reality. 2 days later, a bubble of highly flammable hydrogen gas formed in the No. 2 reactor, leading Governor Dick Thornburgh to issue an evacuation order of some 140,000 residents living near the crippled reactor. With nerves at a breaking point, President Jimmy Carter, a trained nuclear engineer who had helped dismantle a damaged Canadian reactor while serving in the U.S. Navy, arrived on site to calm the runaway fears of distressed locals and the American public at large. After the hydrogen bubble was safely bled from the reactor, it was determined by federal authorities that while plant workers had been exposed to unhealthy levels of radiation, no one outside of the 3 Mile Island complex had been exposed. Once stabilized, a robotic camera was dropped into the core, revealing a complete meltdown of some 50% of the reactor's uranium fuel rods. The accident galvanized anti-nuclear activists throughout the United States, effectively ending all growth in a once promising industry. As of 2021, no additional nuclear power plants have been built in the United States since the accident, making 3 Mile Island a major turning point in a nation's thirst for clean energy. The Iran hostage crisis. During the Iranian Revolution of 1979, violent protests by Muslim college students forced the Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, to flee his homeland for the United States, where he was admitted on compassionate grounds for cancer treatment at the New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center. On February 1, 1979, after 15 years in exile, Shiite religious leader Ayatollah Khomeini was returned to power by jubilant Iranian revolutionaries, eager to see the return of Islamic Sharia law. Believing that the United States was meddling in Iranian affairs, including perceived attempts to undermine the Iranian Revolution, on November 4, 1979, members of the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage for the next 444 days of forced captivity. While President Jimmy Carter froze billions of Iranian assets in the United States, his inability to act decisively during the Iran hostage crisis heavily contributed to his landslide loss to Ronald Reagan in the presidential election of 1980. In September 1980, after the Iraqi military invaded Iran, the start of the Iran-Iraq War hastened the Iranians to the negotiation table with the Americans. Mere hours after Ronald Reagan was sworn into office, the newly minted president signed the Algiers Accords, which repatriated the hostages back to the United States the following day. Since the release of the hostages, Iran and the United States continue to have no formal diplomatic relations, other than puppet diplomacy between Pakistan, who serves as Iran's protecting power, while Switzerland serves as the United States' protective power in Iran. The 1980s. By the end of Jimmy Carter's one-term presidency, America's dreams of the 1960s had been beaten down by inflation, big government spending, and a rising crime rate, leading many Americans to embrace a new social, economic, and political conservatism during the 1980s. The New Right movement was driven by yuppies, or young urban professionals, and disappointed liberals known as Reagan Democrats, which in turn swept Ronald Reagan into office in a landslide victory. Many historians link the rise of the New Right in part due to the erupting growth of the Sun Belt in the southeast-southwestern California, when scores of disillusioned Americans fled northern and midwestern cities to escape aging infrastructures, overcrowding, pollution, and crime. By 1982, the United States was living through its worst economic recession since the Great Depression, witnessing some 9 million unemployed Americans by November of that same year. After Reagan took office on January 20, 1981, he set about making good on his promise to extract the federal government out of Americans' lives and wallets, implementing massive industrial deregulation initiatives, reductions in government spending, and across-the-board tax cuts for individuals and corporations alike. Known as Reaganomics, the president's trickle-down supply-side economic policies fired the American economy, making the decade a prosperous one for most Americans, at the same time tripling the national debt during Reagan's 2 terms in office. Despite such a massive increase in national debt, Reagan left office in 1989 with the highest approval rating of any president since FDR. Pop culture thrived in the 1980s with television shows like 30-something and movies like The Big Chill and Bright Lights, Big City, which portrayed a generation of otherwise successful young Americans who suffered from anxiety and self-doubt. At the movie theaters, blockbusters like E.T. the Extraterrestrial, Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Beverly Hills Cop took in hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office. Teen movies thrived as well, including The Breakfast Club, Some Kind of Wonderful, and Pretty in Pink. By the end of the 1980s, 60% of American households had cable TV, making shows like MTV an American staple, as it aired music videos by artists such as Duran Duran, Culture Club, Madonna, and Michael Jackson. At the same time, heavy metal acts like Metallica and Guns N' Roses gave expression to a sense of malaise, pandemic among many young Americans, particularly young men, making the 1980s a time to remember for Gen Xers and baby boomers everywhere. Ronald Reagan. Born on February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois, Ronald Reagan grew up to attend high school in nearby Dixon before working his way through Eureka College. At Eureka, he studied economics and sociology, played on the football team, and honed his acting skills in school productions. Upon graduation, he became a radio sports announcer, followed by a screen test in 1937 that won him a contract in Hollywood, leading to a 2 decades-long acting career that spanned 53 films.
Anyway, that isn't what I came over to talk about.
That's strange. I thought Gabe's welfare was your only reason for coming here.
I'm getting tired of telling you you're beautiful.
But I'm not getting tired of hearing it.
That's the marvelous thing about you. You're the only person in the world who likes my dialogue.
As president of the Screen Actors Guild, Reagan became embroiled in disputes over the issue of communism in the film industry during the McCarthy era, which helped to shift his political views from liberal to conservative. He toured the country as a television host, becoming a spokesman for conservatism. In 1966, he was elected governor of California by a margin of 1 million votes, only to be re-elected in 1970 by another landslide margin. Ronald Reagan won the Republican presidential nomination in 1980 and chose as his running mate former Texas Congressman and United Nations Ambassador George Bush. Fearful over runaway inflation and the year-long Iran hostage crisis, voters went in big for Reagan, who won 489 electoral votes to Jimmy Carter's 49. Assuming office on January 20th, 1981, only 69 days into his first term, he was shot by a would-be assassin. While he recovered quickly from his injuries, his grace and wit during the dangerous incident caused his popularity to soar, propelling him to a second-term victory over Democratic challengers Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro.
By its very existence and character, Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. Missed me.
Reagan's 2 terms as president oversaw the return of prosperity at home, as well as resolute foreign policy objectives achieved through his Peace Through Strength initiative abroad. From his first marriage to actress Jane Wyman, he had 2 children, Maureen and Michael, while in 1952 he married screen actress Nancy Davis, raising 2 more children, Patricia Ann and Ronald Prescott. Reagan was the oldest first-term U.S. president in history during his time, a distinction he held until 2017, when Donald Trump was inaugurated at age 70. Reagan passed away on June the 5th, 2004, after struggling for years with Alzheimer's disease. The air traffic controller strike of 1981. Since its formation in 1968, PATCO, or the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, had a long history of sick-out protests against the rigid edicts placed upon them by the controller's employer, the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. The sick-outs caused major delays at airports across the United States and abroad, yet by existing federal law, the government union was unable to strike. While PATCO had endorsed Democratic Party candidates since its inception, in 1980, the union refused to back President Jimmy Carter due to ongoing poor labor relations with the FAA, instead backing GOP presidential candidate Ronald Reagan. When contract negotiations began in February of 1981 between PATCO and the FAA, citing safety concerns, PATCO called for a reduced 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase, and a better retirement package than the one they currently enjoyed. When the FAA refused to budge on a shortened work week, at 7 a.m. on August 3, 1981, the union declared a strike. Despite supporting Reagan in 1980, Reagan declared the striking federal workers a peril to national safety, ordering them back to work under the terms of the Taft-Hartley Act. With only 1,300 of the nearly 13,000 controllers responding to Reagan's order, on August 5th, 2 days after the strike began, the president fired 11,345 striking federal controllers.
Let me read the solemn oath taken by each of these employees in a sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated. End of statement.
The mass firings left a huge shortage of certified controllers, forcing airlines to dramatically cut back on the number of flights the system could handle, further prompting the FAA to move supervisors and military controllers into control towers across the nation. While the FAA initially claimed that staffing levels would be restored within 2 years, in reality, it took 10 before pre-strike staffing levels were finally achieved. The Iran-Contra affair. The Cold War-era Iran-Contra affair became headline news in 1986 after a Beirut newspaper first reported on an arms deal between the United States and Iran, despite U.S. sanctions dating back to the Iran hostage crisis, under the thinly veiled objective of buying the release of 7 hostages held by Iranian-backed terrorists in Lebanon. In an effort to skirt legislation passed by Democrats known as the Boland Amendment, which restricted the CIA and the Department of Defense from engaging in foreign conflicts, Reagan gave tacit approval to National Security Council head Robert McFarlane and staffer Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, who devised a scheme to finance the Contras, a group of drug-dealing guerrillas fighting the Marxist government of Nicaragua, by overcharging Iran for weapons, in turn siphoning off the profits to the Contras.
I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a neat idea.
Navy Vice Admiral John Poindexter, the President's National Security Advisor, testified before Congress that he kept details of the covert operations from the President and his advisors, including Secretary of State George Shultz and Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger.
Under whose authority was the mission carried out? Did the President know?
You know, the buck stops here with me. I made the decision. I felt that I had the authority to do it. I thought it was a good idea. I was convinced that the president would, in the end, think it was a good idea.
Sometimes I feel like I'd like to wring somebody's neck.
I asked Admiral Poindexter directly, does the president know? He told me he did not.
After a congressional investigative committee began probing the Iran-Contra deal, along with a Reagan-appointed independent investigative group known as the Tower Commission, the politically divided House and Senate were troubled to find that a major policy initiative was carried out by private businessmen, yet run by National Security Council staff. When the Congressional Committee's final report was issued in late 1987, the report ruled that the ultimate responsibility for the events in the Iran-Contra affair rested solely on the president. And while the president may not have known what his national security advisors were doing, he should have. While the American press hounded Reagan over the matter for the rest of his presidency, by the end of his second term, only one private contractor, Thomas Kleins, actually served prison time for his part in the Iran-Contra affair. And while Reagan himself acknowledged under oath that the entire affair was a mistake, his many supporters ultimately shelved the Iran-Contra affair to a largely overlooked place in American history, helping to build on Reagan's lasting moniker as the Teflon president.